highlighting a fantastic book that you've recently launched this year in February, but also highlighting this fantastic collection that you've had for some time here and sharing these quite incredible sort of cultural phenomena of the phantom shields of Papua New Guinea. In the sense of Michael Reid, we are happy for this collaboration because we've been working with Chris for over 10 years now, either as fairs or in our old location at Gallery and here. So I just thought I would say thank you for tonight and introduce you. For those that don't know, Chris is the author, publisher of the book that we're launching tonight, and also the man behind this wonderful exhibition.
Thank you.
Surprise
Thank you very
enough?
much. Oh, that was
Check the
wonderful.
surprise. Can you tell us a little about the exhibition?
Let me say it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and thanks to Michael Reid and all his group here for inviting me to show in the gallery, which we've done for many years. These shields are from the New Guinea Highlands, and as you can see, they're all very colourful, and that's very much part of the New Guinea tradition to have colourful shields, so that when the warriors are out fighting, you know, in the hills and the valleys, the shields stand out very strongly in the landscape. But before we talk about the shields, can I just take a step back, a little bit of an introduction to the New Guinea Highlands, just so we set everything in a historic perspective. And humans first arrived in New Guinea 60,000 years ago. They came down through Asia, and probably 30 to 40,000 years ago they moved up into the highlands of New Guinea and settled in the valleys of New Guinea, began to make a lifestyle up there. And for the rest of history they were very isolated. They didn't come back down to the coast was bigger than travel up. So for 30,000 years we could say the highlands was isolated from the rest of the world. And all these changes went on. There were other migrations came through New Guinea, but they bypassed the highlands. And but in that time, the highlands developed a very rich culture. Always like technologically Stone Age, but it was a sophisticated culture. Probably 10,000 years ago in the highlands, they began to develop irrigation in what was then a wetter climate, and they had a lot of lakes through the large valleys. And 80,000 years ago, these irrigation drains became quite sophisticated. And just to put it in historical context, the irrigation in the Middle East, in Egypt and Mesopotamia was 10,000 years ago. So the same human developments were happening in the highlands of New Guinea as were happening in, you know, what we call the cradle of civilization. But because the highlands is cut off, you know, they remain technologically Stone Age. And even when the Germans arrived in the 1870s, 1880s, they would look up into the highlands and think nobody lived up there. So it was thought to be, you know, uninhabited, even though they named the big mountains after, like Mount Wilhelm, the main mountain in Papua New Guinea is Mount Wilhelm, after the German Kaiser, Mount Hagen, after, you know, the German administrator. And it wasn't until the 1930s that Australian gold prospectors going up there opened up the highlands to new trends, and the Australian administration came in, took over colonially, and from that period warfare in the highlands was very much suppressed. You know, it was a United Nations Trust territory, and this is very important in the bigger world, to stop warfare. And warfare pretty well ceased from the 1950s until well into the 1970s, when it slowly started to increase again. Now the interesting thing is that with the Australian administration, education came in probably in the 1960s more and more, and the Phantom comic arrived in Papua New Guinea in the early 1970s. It began almost immediately to be serialised in the newspaper. So the Phantom was very much in the mindset of young Papua New Guineans in that 70 era. And these young people who were probably learning to speak English and read and write, reading the Phantom, as they grew up, into the 1980s, as warfare was re-establishing itself, here were these people who already knew and understood the Phantom and what he meant, were becoming the new warriors of the day. And what did they painted various things on their shields, but one item that became iconic with this new generation of now educated Papua New Guinea warriors was this guy, the Phantom. They loved him. And he fitted just so well with the cosmology of the Papua New Guinea Highlands for any number of reasons. And number one, a warrior in the Papua New Guinea Highlands has to be very resolute and strong, morally superior to his adversaries. And the Phantom very much projected this moral superiority that they loved. He was a protector of less fortunate people that they loved. The Phantom was a man who had all these ancestors behind him, and often in the comics you would see the Phantom standing with all his ancestors behind him. And the people related to this very strongly, that here is the Phantom who will help us, but all his ancestors are there also, with the power of the past. The Phantom lived in the Skull Cave up in the mountains, and you can see one shield over here, this Phantom, but behind him is the Skull Cave. And he lived up in the high mountains. And in Highlands mythology, when people die, usually they stay around the village while everyone they know in life is still alive. But slowly they drift up into the high mountains. So the ancient ancestors are always living in the high mountains where the Phantom came from. And again, another connection. But probably more than anything, you can see on some shields, further back, it will say, man who cannot die, or sometimes they write in Pidgin, mani no sabi die. But this thing that here is a Phantom who would never die. So what better to write on your shield if you're going in to fight your adversaries than you can't kill me. With the artists, and let me put this in perspective, we're talking about like the 1980s, going into the 1990s is really when the Phantom shields started to be painted. And the people who often painted the Phantom shields were not the warrior themselves who was carrying the shield, but they would employ a man who was often a sign writer to paint a design on the shield. And because of this history of the comics and the Phantom started to be painted probably in the mid-1980s, is the first time we really see this happening. And into the 90s, more and more, the Phantom really became quite iconic on the war shields. And something happened then in the 1990s. Guns were introduced into warfare. And when guns started to be used, of course the wooden shields were no longer useful. And slowly they became obsolete. They were just not used. And for a short time, over here, you see there's one metal shield on the wall. The people in New Guinea would use maybe the roof of a car, or this one is a rolled out 44-gallon drum. They would paint similar designs on those, but this would at least protect you from the shotguns used in warfare. But a couple of years later, high-powered rifles, various other more sophisticated weapons came to warfare, so they too disappeared. And with the artists themselves, just to say briefly, we know probably 2 or 3, maybe even 4 names of the artists. Many of them we don't know. The man who painted this one over here with his skull caves, he's still alive, and even though he hasn't painted Phantom shields for a number of years, he loved the Phantom comic. So many of his shields reflect very much a comic-like appearance, where many of the other shields you can see are compilations of aspects of the Phantom. The first shield here on the wall, the Phantom head, but he's surrounded by skulls, which is the ring of the Phantom, and also in the middle of the top is there's another ring the Phantom uses. I've forgotten what it's called, but that's the good ring. The one with the skull is the bad ring, the one he punches the enemy with. Femme was often in the comics with her pistols, and now the pistols were coming into tribal warfare. More and more you see the Phantom appearing in pistols, with pistols. Maybe I'll just, are there any questions? Because sometimes, questions bring up interesting aspects of the Phantom Shield and the Papua New Guinea warfare that I haven't crossed. If anyone's got anything they want to ask, please go ahead.
Have any of the shields been into battle?
I was just going to ask something like that.
And they said spearboats.
Look, probably a few of them are older, yes. Definitely the traditional shield in the middle, as you can see, would have been in battle. Some of the others, quite possibly they have been. But it brings up the interesting point that round about like the late 90s, early 2000s, because wooden shields could no longer be used in warfare, then there began a market, if you like, in shields. It became an art object rather than a war object. And that was fueled by a number of things. One was, one character from the British Museum was collecting contemporary shields in the mid-90s, a guy called Mike O'Hanlon. He put in a big exhibition in London. And they saw him and other like art dealers coming through, like myself, as an avenue to actually not only, okay, the shields are still there, but we can't use them anymore, let's paint them and sell them. So it began moving out into an international market. Remember, you were going to ask something.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, this looks more like tribal and traditional, and would that sort of be like
Along the top.
cuckoo or something? Yeah, the top,
The triangles. Yeah. Let's say the first Phantom shields were painted were often very traditional, with the triangles down the sides or the top, and in the middle you might have the Phantom head. And then slowly the Phantom design became more and more part of the shield. So more and more the traditional elements disappeared. But in this one, it's got both the traditional triangles and then
And would you know what tribe that might be?
They're all from the same tribe, really, in the Wagi Valley, and they're it's actually the eastern end of the Wagi Valley. Chiwaka is the name. Yeah.
Because you know so much. There's the clan, the Kuku.
Yeah.
They were the fiercest warriors.
Yes.
Back in the day.
Yes.
And then they became the security guards of New Guinea.
Yes. Now the Kukus were from much further to the east. So it wasn't these people, and their shields were quite small.
Yeah.
Where the Wagi Valley, these are probably the biggest shields ever made. And like look at this one.
Yeah, it's huge.
I mean, there'd be 3 or 4 warriors would hide behind that with their bows and arrows and their spears.
Yeah, well, great.
Yes.
Where are these sourced from? Different countries or from all?
No, they're all. Let me see. All from Australia, and many of them I collected myself in Papua New Guinea.
Anyway, thanks.
All right. Yeah, so most of them I collected myself. Sorry about that. I should have turned it off.